Welcome back to the Redacted Culture Cast. Today's episode, episode 83, is a long-awaited topic, and I hope that you are ready to buckle down and dig into the moral foundations of violence, particularly from a biblical perspective. This is exemplary of what we wish to accomplish here at the Redacted Culture Cast, or through us here at Redacted LLC, and that is to bring a hopefully to bring a level of the intellect back into gun culture. It's not so much to say that we've been overruled by the more brutish of types. However, I think it's worth mentioning that for the last couple generations, most of what we would refer to as American gun culture has taken mostly an anti-intellectual route, and that is why that is in some cases why we struggle with the issues that we do today. It's not so much that we are going to be able to craft articulate arguments and win over everyone we're debating with, but rather it's most important, in my opinion, and from my observation in our world, that when we do what we do and we act as we act, we do so with the courage and boldness, knowing that what we are doing is right. In some ways, so much of gun culture's, let's just say, conversation has been primarily driven by this idea of providing a witty retort against a would-be gun control advocate. Rather, while that may have its place, this isn't the episode for you. This is the episode where we dig into some of the more aggressive foundations, some of the more important philosophical roadblocks, building blocks that get us to where we are at today, or get us to the point of why we believe what we believe. It's not with any sense of trivialness that I say this show is about what we believe to be right and true and good. And those words, right, true, and good, are things that point to not only this idea of virtue, but essentially the moral foundation for why we act the way that we act. A thing that is good might sound like a navel gazing experience to those whose idea of philosophy is some sort of development of whatever I think about whatever I want to feel about, or is this sort of aimless exploration into topics in that ivory tower fashion that have no correlation to reality. But if you look at the history of philosophy, theology, and the life of the mind, those who have engaged in this study are very much so rooted and grounded in reality. In fact, their curiosity, their questioning, and their drive is to better understand and articulate that which is true, and hopefully that which is good as well. And so we say right and true and good as the driving factors by which we make decisions in this world and what we choose to pursue as goals. That being said, the majority of this episode is going to be focused on Christian understandings of violence. And I think this is an important position to state, or no, it's not even that I think. I have to start here because if you've been listening to the show, it is no surprise that it should not come. I hope it doesn't come as a surprise to you that I consider myself a Christian. And what does that mean? Well, in the 21st century, where we have allowed the muddying of lines to sort of take over so much of what we consider the church, what I mean by a Christian is somebody who believes a series of principle or series of premises to be true, that there is a God, that we are created in his image, that the Bible is inerrant, that it is the written word of God, that there are things that a person can choose to believe or not believe that does have some sort of defining factor over whether or not they appropriately fit into the category of Christian. For example, if you don't believe in Jesus, who is the Christ, you can't really call yourself a Christian. Then the question comes up, how far does that go? Well, I think the Nicene Creed was pretty clear in saying that if you do not believe that he was the Son of God, well, then how would you really consider yourself a Christian? But we digress. So there's this one thing within Christianity that needs to be addressed, especially within Christian doctrine and theology. It seems like Christians in the 21st century, in our day and age, are mostly blind or struggle with understanding how we would even address this concept of violence, the application of violence justice, mercy, and strength in character, and so forth. In fact, it seems like the prevailing spirit of the era is this sort of pseudo-intellectual approach to turning the other cheek, and this soft form of pacifism, which almost comes across as resentment. And I'll be clear, I don't think that all forms of pacifism are necessarily immoral, but there are certainly forms of it that I think there are certainly forms of it that are contradictory to the moral code of the Bible. An example of this and what it would look like in pacifism is if you claim to be a pacifist, but you are willing to call onto other people to do that violence for you, you are not only not a pacifist, but an egregious hypocrite. Shame on you in that sense. The idea that someone could call themselves a pacifist, but still call onto, say, the police to do their violence on their behalf, to protect them in that way, is the sort of pacifist immorality which really only cares about being perceived as moral as opposed to acting moral and being consistent in what they believe. And there are some other ideas that extend into how we think about violence in moral foundations that tends to become very difficult. So we've already addressed one issue briefly, and that's this idea of pacifism. So, and it's not that necessarily pacifism is moral or immoral, but it's hard, but you cannot really call yourself a pacifist if you export that violence to other people, and or you kind of rely that responsibility on other folks. That being the case, here are two other phrases that you very likely have heard. One, violence is a necessary evil. The validity of this question will be brought up in the remainder of this episode, and the validity of another claim, violence is necessarily evil, will be the other one. And I want to sort of debunk both of these ideas throughout the course of this talk. So let's start with this idea of violence within a biblical perspective, within a Christian or biblical perspective. Those who are aware, or those who have read the Bible, or at least enough of the Bible to have a pretty good touch and feel between the New Testament and the Old Testament, will recognize that there's some tension between the sort of overblown turn the other cheek mentality that's cast across the New Testament, and then the Old Testament, where you have a God that seems to be very focused on justice. If you take this is an example of what happens when you just take one aspect of or one section of the Bible, one small section of the Bible, absent the context of the rest of the Bible, and you build your theology or your belief on that concept. If your only understanding of violence, if your only interest in studying the concept from a biblical perspective comes from that one New Testament verse that says, turn the other cheek, then you are going to have a very hard time understanding the rest of the Bible. In fact, some of it may come across as rather foreign to you. But hey, this isn't to just cast doubt on other things. It's simply to look at how do we understand such such a complex and important topic. Pulling back a little bit from specifically talking about the Bible, we have to think about what is it that we're talking about when we talk about violence. Is violence the immoral application of force? Or is violence something else? Is violence simply the application of force? Do we call something violent when we are trying to ascribe a certain moral weight to it? Or is it simply violence because it involves the physical or overt in forms of conflict between human beings? Is it restricted to acts between human beings? Is it restricted to beings of the same ontology? These are all going to be hard questions. So I took a section. There's this book called The New Dictionary of Biblical Theology. I actually don't think it's new because I pulled it out. It's a book from a couple of years ago, but it's still useful. It includes excerpts, articles, and sort of dictionary-like statements about subjects. On its attempts to define violence, we start with this phrase. The Bible begins with the foundational premise that the fallen world, and humanity in particular, is violent. We see this, and I'll continue with the reading. The primeval human history that unfolds east of Eden begins with fratricide and is characterized by the vengeful cry of Lamech, who boasts of committing retribution against those who commit violence against him. An entire episode of human history is sealed with the narrator's judgment that, quote, the earth was filled with violence, Genesis 6:11. The biblical logic of redemption, reviewed through the canonical lens of the incarnation and the cross, see atonement, allows no other course for its plot line than to run the gauntlet of human violence. But the outcome is a divine and dramatic resolution of violence and the world-transforming power of the gospel. Now, the author of this article, this definition, would be D.G. Reed, and he includes a bibliography. It's quite a long but useful explanation. And if you take the story of the Bible, which is in one way what he does, is he traces how violence is portrayed throughout historical examples. Case in point being before the flood, after the flood, before or during the lifetime of Abraham, during the conquest of Canaan, after the Israelites, Hebrews, leave Egypt. So we have the plagues done on the plagues done on Egypt. We have the conquest of Canaan, the kingdoms of Israel, their fall, and then the New Testament, the words of Jesus, the writings of Paul, and so forth. And it's important to start here where we can already dismiss another one of those two phrases that we've used in the past, that violence is necessarily evil. If violence was necessarily evil and God is, by definition, necessarily good, then we have a contradiction when God commands the people of Israel, or even partakes in it through his miraculous ways, in war, divine war against the people of Canaan. There is a line that comes from the Old Testament where the land of Canaan, which eventually becomes Israel, is promised to the children of Abraham, and Abraham is told that your children will be promised this land, but not yet, because the evil of the Amorites has yet to come to fruition. You see an early example of God being consistent with his own choice in judgment and justice coming forward. But what we do have this problem with, as far as when it comes to the concept of violence, is that the Old Testament, especially this example of the wars and the conquest of Canaan, also known as Israel, is that God not only commands it, but he leads it in certain ways. So if we were to say something like violence is necessarily evil, that in all possible ways, we're using modal logic at this time, in all possible worlds and at all possible times, it is necessary to state, that means there is no option but that violence itself is evil, then God is not God, but whoever is talking in the Old Testament has to be something else, because God cannot be evil. That which defines good cannot be evil. I'm going to restate that. The thing that we refer to as God, whether you are agnostic or Christian, is that which determines morality. And if therefore it's what determines morality, then whatever it chooses to do, if that thing, that being, that person, whatever it is the thing which arbitrates morality, then whatever that thing does is therefore good. Well, let me be clear on this one. If we have a hierarchy in some ways, or an hierarchy, if that's how you want to pronounce it, if we have this example of if we have this idea of an hierarchy or a hierarchy where the thing at the top is God, then everything is compared to that thing as the standard. And whatever that thing, that being, that force, that concept does, that is what is considered good. It is arbitrary by its existence, by whatever it is, the determining factor of that which is good. So therefore, it cannot do evil because the source of good cannot do what is contradictory to itself. And therefore, if God were to be, if evil, I'm sorry, if violence was necessarily evil, or even in this sense a necessary evil, then it would work. It would be in contradiction to the idea, the reality of who God is. This is just the opening blossom, the first intellectual problem when it comes to Christians, religious people, or actually, since all people are fundamentally religious, because everyone has some form of morality, and since this is the fundamental part of it, the first question, the first blossom, this is where we must start. We can at least come to the conclusion that if violence is simply the use of force, mind you, I'm going to be using that temporarily. If violence is simply the use of force, then it is neither necessarily good or necessarily evil according to the Bible. According to the Bible does not come to the conclusion specifically that that violence is necessarily good or necessarily evil if the definition of violence is merely the use of force, thinking swinging a sword, shooting a gun, and perhaps even waging economic warfare on people. But the Bible does do a pretty good job of distinguishing between the act of violence itself and the act of going to war. In some ways, this is actually where we get this idea of jus in bello, jus ad bellum, the distinction between jus in bello, the moral actions of an individual engaging in war, and jus ad bellum, which is justification for war, or as we like to call it, just war theory. If you want to dig deeper and deeper into that, many of these foundations comes from the man whose name I'm going to mispronounce. I apologize to you Catholics, but Augustinian, this guy, Saint Augustine of Hippo, Saint Augustine of Hippo. Yes, I know I'm going to pronounce it wrong because I always do. Sorry. I enjoy him as an author, still can't seem to pronounce his name correctly. Take with that as you will. Beverage. It's not meant to be ironic, but I'm drinking a liquid death right now while we're talking about violence. Great branding. But that being the case, so we've started addressing perhaps we're starting to rule that the easy answers out of this question are not valid. That the easy sort of escapism questions, the attempts to dodge this question, don't actually stick in the real world. This idea that violence is necessarily evil, according to a biblical foundation, is it's inconsistent. It's inconsistent with a full teleological understanding of the Bible, a full beginning to end understanding or perspective of the Bible. In order to come to the conclusion that violence or the application of force is necessarily evil, you must commit the sin of picking and choosing which parts of the Bible you want to be true and which parts are to be discarded. And if you are in any way, shape, or form familiar with what the Bible says about such things, you're in for a rough time. And I good luck is all I can really say about that. But for those of us who have come to this conclusion that we've started ruling out easy answers, ruling out the cheap shot answers, it doesn't necessarily give us the easiest standpoint to begin with. Because now the only thing that we know, or at least so far as this show has gone on or this discussion has gone on, is that it is not the case that violence can be quickly or easily described solely as evil, unless, mind you definitionally, unless our definition of violence includes not only the use of force, but a moral application to it as well. Unless we are saying that the word violence is the word that we use for the use of force in an immoral way. So therefore, calling violence immoral would be sort of redundant, if that is the definition, the way that we are defining the word violence. How does the Bible how does the Bible itself define violence? I wish I could say I was fully confident in it, but I as far as I understand, and as far as I've come so far as where I'm going, is that it tends to be more concerned about evaluating or describing the moral actions therein and giving advice about it, not advice, but giving commandments about the use of force as well as the application of violence, than it does simply trying to define it. In some ways, it defines what we would want to call things by the commands that it gives. An example of this comes from the book of Proverbs, which is an Old Testament book for those who are newer into the scriptures. And that it says the book of Proverbs was written by Solomon, and it is essentially a book of wisdom. Why is that appropriate? Well, if you want to play a word game here, Solomon is historically referred to as the wisest man to ever live. We are oftentimes reminded of the difference between wisdom and intelligence. We are oftentimes reminded of the difference between wisdom and intelligence, as we are reminded of the difference between access to information and evaluation of information. And so, despite many tragedies and horrible decisions that Solomon continued to make through his life, he is still referred to at least as the wisest man to ever walk the earth. And so it is, and since wisdom does come from God, we must read his words with a sense of reverence, especially considering it's written in the Bible. Therefore, if we believe that the Bible is inerrant, then we should understand it to be stating what is true. Admittedly, Proverbs is not always the easiest one to read, but if you want to, I highly recommend this book. It's called, it's the Christian Counselor's Commentary of Proverbs by J. Adams, or J.E. Adams. I highly recommend it. It helps illuminate and understand some of the parts of the book of Proverbs in a way where you might overlook it or skip past it. I can testify that it has, for me, who's read the book of Proverbs many, many times over, it helped bring life to sections of the book of Proverbs that I thought, I don't do that. It's not a problem to me. Turns out I was wrong. So there you go. If you're looking for something to read, it's not easy, but it's worth engaging with. So let me find this specific verse. Alrighty. The verse that he is commenting on is Proverbs 3:31. I'm going to read 29, 30, and 31 just to give it grounds. Verse 29. Do not plan evil against your neighbor who lives alongside of you, trusting you. 30. Don't pick a quarrel with someone for no reason when he has done nothing evil to you. 31. Do not envy a violent person or choose any of his ways. Now, J. Adams' commentary on 29 and 30 goes something like this. Verses 29 and 30 have to do with unnecessary conflict. The Christian counselee must avoid the one who provokes it. Indeed, some don't only wrong a neighbor through their thoughtlessness, but deliberately plan to do so. This is a statement that will hopefully, for most of us, put to death the idea that evil does not exist in the world. That in this world that we live in, that every single form of conflict and challenge between people can somehow be explained away by a great misunderstanding. That is an extremely naive worldview that believes sort of in this heritage of the early 1900s, can't we just get along garbage, that all forms of disagreement and all forms of conflict between peoples can simply be explained away by a misunderstanding between parties. Rather, in these small verses written in Proverbs, which again, if you don't use the Bible as a foundation, we'll have to get to that later. But in this book of Proverbs, we see this argument. Do not plan evil against your neighbor. Do not plan evil against your neighbor. It doesn't say do not plan misunderstanding. It doesn't say do not plan confusion. It doesn't say do not plan malice. It says do not plan evil against your neighbor. And then it goes on to say, don't envy a violent person or choose any of his ways. And I quote from J. Adams, another problem many have is envy. Because they see another getting his way by means of violence, they envy what he gets and adopts his ways. The violent person will end up the violent person will end up in violence directed towards himself. Moreover, all of his ways are wrong. The counselee may not pick and choose amongst them. Instead, he must not choose any of his ways. In addition, notice that to do so is a matter of choice. Care must be taken not to allow anyone to blame any of his violent ways on the one who has chosen to emulate. He knew what they were like. They were violent enough to call attention to themselves. But though he knew and knew that they were sinful ways, he chose to adopt some or all of them for what he could get by doing so. Envy is a warped, evil attitude that can lead one to the grossest sorts of sins. You will encounter it in many counselees. Where you discover the violent ways in a counselee, look for envy. Where you discover envy in a counselee, look for or warn about the possibility of violence. Now, before we get too far in, this book again is an advice book, and we're not talking about Proverbs, we're talking about the commentary on Proverbs by J. Adams, is a book that is used for people who are Christian counselors, as well as for those who wish to study as a commentary on these verses in the Bible. Which is why he's referring to the counselee, the counselee, the counselee. In other words, if you're giving counsel using this as a foundation, this is what you're going to want. You're going to be dealing with. It says, "Be warned: if you find envy in a counselee, look also for violent ways. If you find violence in a person, look for envy." On a cultural level, we could expand and look back a little bit. Take a look at communism. It begins with envy and ends in violence. I don't think it needs to go too much further than there. I know communism tends to be a political subject, but instead of looking at communism as an ideology, look therefore at communists who tend, if not always, are envious people who are willing to use violence to get their means. This is a statement that I can say I've seen universally, and anyone who's committed to this idea of communism has also been willing to make exceptions for violence. They look at the violence of the communists of the 1900s, who killed 100 million people, and say, well, we can take some of their ways because that wasn't true communism. Jordan Peterson has had his commentary on this one, but that's on a macro scale. What does it look like on a micro scale? What does it look like when we are taking advice like this and bringing it on the level of introspection? What does it mean that we're looking at ourselves? We could look out into the world and throw daggers at ideologies like communism, but which for all its intents and purposes is probably just not only a weak ideology, but a violent one in its own right. If we were to look outward, what happens when we look inward? What happens when we look at ourselves? We need to begin with let's begin with this one. Envying a violent person. The first things that come to mind are going to be superhero type characters and to another extent video games. I'm going to actually have to pause this recording here, so we will come back in a minute. All right, so picking up where we left off, if you want a side commentary, the postage mail system is the opposite of Gandalf. It either arrives late or early and never when it intends to. But we are still, as Gandalf is supposed to be a great leader, thankful that we have at least a semi-functioning postal service, whether it's the USPS, UP, whatever. Moving on. So where did we leave off? We were talking about envying a violent man. And while it's easy in some sense to look out at different ideologies in the world and see how those ideologies glorify or try to extract elements of being violent or a violent person and justify them in certain ways. Let's just say like books like The In Defense of Looting, or an easy example, probably Punching Low, is Malcolm Nance, They Want to Kill Americans. Well, we can easily look out and see examples of people who have written or built ideologies envying violent people, even perhaps in some ways. The harder thing to do, the harder challenge, is to look inside, look internally. And so we should be able to ask, we should be asking ourselves this question: is where in my life, or where am I envying a violent person? And it can become quite challenging quickly, because what happens, what do we mean by envying a violent person? Does it mean emulating them? Do we want to build our lives around the capability of violence, or something like this? And I think this is a really hard question for us to answer, and this is probably where we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about when it comes to moral foundations for violence. In the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, we understand that God commands people to do things that we would describe as violent, and by being his nature as God, cannot not being able to do evil. We recognize that the simple answers do not kind of fit in a more comprehensive understanding of the world. Simple answers being like violence is a necessary evil, or violence is necessarily evil, and rather now we're stuck here. And I think that a verse like this, Proverbs 31, or Proverbs 3:31, do not envy a violent person or choose any of his ways, has a greater level of greater weight over our decision making and our thought life than something as simple as something as simple as thinking of it in purely overt terms, like in purely categorical terms. Let me go on. This is what I would describe, and this is what I think, this is where it's coming out of when we're talking about violence and a violent person. One, we get to start with envy. Do not envy a person for his violent ways, and do not and be warned, because envy leads to violence. What is envy? Envy is beyond something. Envy is that form of moral or immoral. Envy is that form of immoral desire to have what somebody else has: fame, power, wealth, money, time, experience, whatever. Envy in this sense is a envy in this sense is can be quantified as a few different things. One of them, it can be qualified as a lack of gratitude for the life that you have been given by God, or this life. Envy can also be something like supplanting the moral order of the universe with your own. I reject your morality and in place my own. Envy can, so in other words, it's not justified that I don't get what I want, kind of thing. Envy can also be things that come out, and they're always ugly. I think we always see it when they're ugly. That every accomplishment that every other person has to be illegitimate and bullshit, whereas every accomplishment that I have is just is misunderstood, or not appreciated. Then, and what is that? What would even a statement like that do? It would identify that you're not in it for the right reasons, and therefore it's justified that you do not receive the benefit of said achievement. An example of this would be in my own life, and this is a bit of a conviction of how I responded to some of the graduations from schools in the military, like Ranger School or RIP. In some ways, I was not grateful for them, and I was not thankful for them, and so even I was not thankful for the hard work, and that I had the opportunity to do it, that I was provided passing opportunities. Rather, I became angry, and I thought that they were a waste of time. They didn't really give me what I wanted, and so therefore, because I wanted them to do something that they couldn't do, I wanted Ranger School to make me a man, let's just say. And that's not what Ranger School does. But because I wanted it to do that and it didn't do what it couldn't do, I did not have the satisfaction of graduating the school in a way. Well, I did graduate, I did get my Ranger tab, but I did not get it in the way that I wanted it to. Essentially, I set my expectations incorrectly. And now let's go talk. I'm kind of getting off topic on this one, but I think it's worth mentioning. So, as we dig back into violence, then maybe I think it's worth considering where and how we are envying a violent man. And one of the most valuable cultural references for this position is 100% the anti-hero. Eventually, I want to do an entire episode on the myth of the anti-hero, sort of dissolving this idea that you can have an immoral by character but moral by circumstance individual who doesn't really choose to do the right thing because it is right, but he sort of gets suckered into it by circumstances. Very popular in the late 80s and the early 90s, continues on to this day. But I think the anti-hero is a really good example of trying to fudge the lines between that violent man sort of experience and getting some sort of moral outcome. So I would say, not I would say, it's not even about me. Let's go to the conclusion. Anti-heroes are not heroes for a reason. They're immoral and should not be considered in leagues with heroes. Anti-heroes are people who do things for reasons that are not good and therefore cannot be considered moral. And since they cannot be considered moral except by the outcome of the events that they take place in, because it's not really their choice, then anti-heroes are the things where we go, thank goodness it turned out that way, but he still is discarded in the immoral category. Remember, when we're talking about the application of violence, this isn't a child's game, in that sense that this isn't a child's game. The action, the choice, the responsibility of becoming capable of violence, though may being necessary but not sufficient to acting in some form of moral way, does place upon you the weight of that responsibility. It doesn't mean that we need to go about moaning under the weight of it as we live our daily lives, but we see this reflected in people who take the understanding of violence too trivially, where they sort of trivialize it into whatever I want or whatever happens in every format. They're not responsible for their actions, they're just reacting. Or I will just do whatever's legal. That's another example of abdicating your responsibility as a thinking being. If you're interested in what was the message behind Into Beasts, Season 1, Operation 2, that is the seed. We will abdicate morality. We will try to abdicate our sense of morality, try to reject our conscience by making ourselves into monsters. Warning against that. Don't do that. So back to the Christian understanding of violence. So we know a couple of things that we know one thing from the beginning. It's not so simple. This idea of violence is not so simple as just being necessarily evil, or a necessary evil for that matter. It's not so simple. We also know that there's a difference between the justification of war and just actions in war. If we even reduce that concept to the self, there is a difference between being justified in the use of violence or the use of force. I am choosing to use force, and the rules, the justified rules, the moral rules within that use of force. An example between the two is you may be justified in the use of force for self-defense, but you are not allowed to, or it is immoral to use an inappropriate level of force in response. If a child, a youth is attacking you maybe with fists, it could technically be considered some form of violence. It is not moral to engage in a different type of violence that is so outside of the category. So we've covered a little bit of that, the difference between justification in war and justification for war, the difference between justified actions, justified uses of violence, and justification for the application of violence. We've also covered that it's not so simple. We've also started to cover a couple of other things. Now, what about the New Testament? Oh, yes, and importantly, not envying a person who is violent. If we see a person acting in a form of justified violence, be wary not to see simply that application of violence as the thing which is to be emulated. That is a component, but it better be justice, not violence. So, death to the anti-hero. So as we get into the New Testament, though, and here's another thing that I want to chip away at and get rid of before we go too much further into this one. There's this idea that the New Testament enforces and requires pacifism. This is the turn the other cheek mentality, pray for those who persecute you mentality. It is oftentimes taken as an absolute, and in some cases, that's an acceptable response. In some cases, for example, pray for those who hurt you, it is correct. We could see this as a universal application. It is our intent and goal as Christians. In fact, what we would want is that even those who persecute us for what we believe to end up entering into a covenant relationship with God. We don't want, in other words, as Christians, we are commanded in the New Testament to live, act, and think in such a way where even those who we are fighting against are seen as created in the image of God, and it would be something that a desired outcome for them to cease persecution and choose instead to worship God. That does not include necessarily taking the blow in every way, shape, or form. There have been multiple cultural breakdowns of the term turning the other cheek, but what the New Testament does not preach, what the New Testament does not command, is this pseudo-Christian example of endless grace. And what I mean by endless grace is that it is the thoughtless, emotion-driven, continual belief that you are not expected to quote unquote judge or make decisions about people. You see this coming out quite often in church discipline. The New Testament commands us to act in love, but also the New Testament commands us to act in love. The New Testament also makes statements like it does in the beginning of Romans 13, which most people use as a sort of de facto argument to obey whatever the current government is. And I think there's some room there for discussion, but that's not for today. Rather, it does make this one statement. This is Romans 13, 4. 4 and 5. Actually, let's just start with 13, 1 through 5. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant, and for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for the rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. So what does this say? I think many interpreted this as all forms of government that have ever existed are inherently by God's will. There's a certain element of that. This is certainly true. But we also see this reflected and fulfilled in statements found throughout the Old Testament that when the government is awry, even more specifically, when the government is awry, Then, when the government refuses to follow God, it chooses evil and causes pain and suffering on the people. This is a hard question for the 21st century to deal with, and I don't pretend to be able to answer it in the remainder of time left for this podcast. We'll have to get through it onto another day. But what we do here have is in verse 4 the phrase, rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. The sword being an important tool that not only has great symbology throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, or the Bible as a whole, but is also a tool that's exclusive application in many ways is fighting. I mean, certainly some people have used it against, in other ways, like fighting animals and so forth, but it's almost exclusively a tool of war against man. There is let's see, the Greek word for sword. It's an interesting one too. Let's see this to the Romans, obedience to rulers, Dio ein Einakain upotaso umonon. So in the Greek, we have this word coming up. Da, da, da. Da, 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 da. Maxiron. Yeah, Maxiron. It's talking about specifically a sword. It's not just a alliteration, or I'm sorry, it's not just a illumination that the interpreter of the New Testament in English chose to change. It quite literally says the sword. Do with that as you will. So we now have this statement that we have this statement within the New Testament that the existence of violence is not purely abolished by the death of Christ and his resurrection. So what does this mean for us going forward? Well, we've covered a couple of hard topics already. And what does this mean for us as people? One of them is as much as we include the idea of, or in the Old Testament, as much as we include this idea that we are to exhibit grace and mercy towards other people, even those who attack us, that phrase, that commandment that order is not given absent the context of discernment. This idea that we are supposed to provide endless grace oftentimes comes from a position of sin, rebellion against God, which sees us as somehow more capable or more loving, more forgiving than God himself. Now, God, the God of the God of the universe, and his Son, the Logos, who are part of the Trinity, the Logos, the Son of God and God himself, Jesus Christ, died on the cross for our sins and then was resurrected. So for us to say that we could out-forgive Christ should be understood as not only heretical, but deeply sinful. But we have seen this trend become so common within the Christian church. And that is this idea that our sole and only outlook and reaction, action, and discernment, our action in life is to lay down, be quiet, not complain, and take everything as if we were just the object of abuse. And I wholeheartedly reject that, because the New Testament, the New Testament is full of and commands discernment in applications towards people. Instead of it just simply being a blanket check, just do nothing, take it, it rather commands something that is much more difficult to achieve and something much more difficult to seek after, and that is discernment. A person abuses you, are they your brother? Turn the cheek. But when they stop, but it doesn't mean just take the abuse forever. It doesn't mean put yourself in that abusive position. When you have people who enter into the church whose sole purpose is to cause chaos, division, and separation, the appropriate moral action of the church is to cast them out. There are people, when there are moral standards that we hold each other to as Christians that we don't hold others to. And perhaps in this scenario, we've run into a problem of, when we are talking about how we react to the application of force within people, there is a different standard for those who are Christians and those who are not. But that will have to be discovered and engaged in on a different time. We're kind of running long today. This is, again, a Friday show, and I wanted to start talking about some of the biblical aspects when it comes to the use of force. We can get even more thicker or more deeper into the weeds. For example, the the least intellectual of arguments being that somehow the misinterpretation of the Old Testament, thou shalt not murder, could be replaced with thou shalt not kill. Trust me when I say this one. If that accusation is leveled against you by somebody you are talking to, if they say, but the Bible says thou shalt not kill, turn away. They don't know, turn away. The conversation's over. Because the level of ignorance required to make that kind of statement disqualifies one for participating in a conversation on this level. If you are in a conversation with somebody who's convinced that the Old Testament commandment, and they call themselves an atheist, by the way, if they call themselves an atheist but try to wield your scripture against you by misinterpreting it and throwing it at you, turn away. Let that conversation die. It is over. It will not be productive unless you can turn it into some form of education, but it's all oftentimes dangerous. Second one is, if we take this idea that violence is necessarily evil, we have to reject that because God commands the use of force in the Old Testament. If we think of violence as a necessary evil, we are engaging in the mindset of the anti-hero, which even the book of Proverbs warns us against. Do not envy a violent man. Do not envy any of his ways. And then if we talk about this idea of pacifism as being the only argument made in the New Testament, we are once again wrong. We are simply trying to chip away and remove some of the fallacies that we have established as a culture in the 21st century. We know that we should not be envious of violence. We know that it is a complicated moral subject. We know that our soul is on the line in some extent. And we also know that it is a decision that we have to make consciously by choice, and making cheap excuses out of the answer, it only leads to death and destruction. So that being the case, I know that this is only the beginning, but I don't want to run today too long. We will once again return to the topic of the moral foundations for violence, starting with ideas of the right to self-defense, the right to right to self-defense, the right to self-determination, this idea that we are humans, this idea that we have the rights in general, and we will carry on from there. Eventually, I would like to get into examples and specific arguments for proper use and application of force, but where we recognize that one is, why that is taking time, is because I don't believe that this is a subject that can be accomplished in a single lecture meaningfully. I hope this doesn't come across too much as a lecture either, so there's that. But if we're going to conclude with that one, we've basically underlined some of the introductory and necessary components regarding the application of force and the use of violence, or the understanding of violence as a whole, and we will get back to it in future episodes. For those who are still listening, we are running a pre-order right now on our subdued shirts as well as our inverted shirts, and we are starting a giveaway for a tour knife or two, depending on whatever we come to and however much participation there is. That being the case, if you want to head over to redactedllc.com, you're going to find our store there, and soon you will be able to find a way to sign up for our newsletter, and we will be stay tuned for on social media, specifically on Instagram. We're going to include ways to enter into the giveaway so that we can make sure that you got a knife to base your personality off of. Please don't, because we know it's funny, but yeah, we don't know why we do the things that we do. We just do them, which is the most antithetical phrase that I could make to the intent of this show. Laughter, applause. That being the case, if you want to do us a solid, you want to help out the show, if you want to lead us, if you want to support what we do here for Redacted, you can head over there, pick up some of our merch, and we will talk to you later. Remember, keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry.